Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Soft Landing Podcast, a gentle space for self-discovery. We're your hosts,
Rafaela
and Eric. And this week, we are wrapping up our first season.
Already? Wow.
I know, time flies. And what a season it's been.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really excited to wrap this one up talking about gender.
Yes, I'm excited to get into this topic as well.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really rich and will be a nice bookend to kind of how we started the season too.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Let's get into it.
Okay. So for this week's Eric's Inquiry, I would love to hear what's a practice that you do that gives you gender affirmation. Yeah, so I'll start.
Okay.
For me, it's like hair. Right? Like hair means a lot to me, both for like the masculine and feminine energy that I hold. So like on the top of my head, right? I have been growing my hair out multiple times. When I was in the Peace Corps, I didn't cut it like once for the 2 years I was there, and I was getting it braided regularly, and it was like really cool. And then when I got back home, I cut it once and then started growing it out again, and I've not touched the top of my head since then. I still shave the sides. But that to me, it really does make me feel more connected to this feminine energy that I have. And it makes me feel good about myself in that aspect. And then on the other side of hair is my beard, right? I'm not like a hairy person otherwise, but I have a beard. And I love my beard, and that speaks to the more masculine energy that I also hold. And so for me, hair plays this essential piece for me that really helps me feel good in my body.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
I love how one thing, hair in general, and the different places that it exists and grows means or validates different parts of your identity.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've ever spoken about this so far on the podcast, but I have, I don't really agree so much with the terms masculinity and femininity, or masculine energy, feminine energy.
Yeah.
It sometimes it feels like such a big concept that I cannot grasp its meaning.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know.
No, I feel you.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that I use those words because they are the best words that I feel like we have at our disposal right now. But I don't think that they adequately encapsulate.
Yeah.
I think that they, in a lot of ways, they continue to reinforce this man-woman.
Because is it not like, sometimes it feels like instead of saying man-woman, some people use masculine, feminine, but it still falls into this binary.
Yeah.
That is confusing to me. And even when I think about your question of what is a practice that gives you gender affirmation, and I started thinking back to when I was younger. You know, I grew up in an era when we would call ourselves tomboys, and I was very much pink dresses, get it away from me, you know. And I had on my overalls and backwards cap, and I'm picturing this image of me during my freshman year when I had a backwards cap, I had sagging jeans, I had on big boots, and then, you know, and I just felt good, you know. I felt strong. I think at that time I felt maybe I would use, I don't know if I would have used the word, I felt masculine. This is the early 2000s, but I felt like a badass kind of, you know, but I don't know if I would have said this is either or in terms of gender or energy. And when I think of how people use masculine and feminine, it still just seems like a construct. Like what makes it masculine and feminine, or I don't know. No. I feel like we can talk about this in circles.
But
I'm trying to I respect people who identify with that and it has a meaning for them, but I know for me it just doesn't quite latch on. It doesn't resonate enough for me to use those words for myself. Yeah. I guess I'm one of those, in that sense, I'm just me, you know, like I like this thing, and maybe one person may define it as being feminine, but I'm just like, I like that. You know, one time I had a friend like a year or so ago that called me high femme.
Okay.
And I was like, what? Because that is not
I don't think you're high
something I would ever, you know.
Yeah.
And a part of me was like, offended.
Yeah.
But I was like, but what about me is femme? But I don't know. I think my brain is spiraling right now, and I want to kind of outline it a little better. But hopefully what I'm saying is making sense.
Yeah.
But I also know, going from my tomboy parts from when I was a younger person, I think I still struggle with being boxed into certain language and word. Like, you know, I hate when, like, don't call me a lady. I don't know what it is about the word lady. I have a very visceral reaction to being called a lady.
Mine is bro.
Bro?
I hate it. I will let brother slide because typically that's like a more racial context. But when someone's like bro, I'm just like, ew, my skin crawls when someone says that to me. Yeah. It just bothers me a lot.
Yeah. And I think what it gets to is, even when we're looking at these words, it's what is the meaning or definition or the intention behind how it's used that makes us feel uncomfortable. So to me, someone using lady, it's like this idealized image of a woman or something that they may be expecting me to live up to, how I'm supposed to compose myself and carry myself. You know, I grew up like, you have to be a lady. And I'm like, I'm not a lady. I'm like, I'm out here playing with Tonka trucks and in the dirt and running with all my brothers and their friends and stuff. Like, nothing about me is lady. Likewise, the reason why some people don't want to be called a certain gender is because of the implications. Like, if you're calling me a woman or a man or whatever, like, what are the expectations you are now setting and expecting for me to follow through with? Yeah. And that is really what we are pushing up against. Yeah. I wonder if there weren't these social norms associated with these names, if people would care as much. But I know that if you say this word, then you're thinking I should look this way, behave this way. Right. But what if it was just like, we just automatically looked at it as a spectrum instead of a rigid idea?
No, I feel that. And even, for me, one of the terms that I love that is also part of the reason why I love my hair is like genderfuck and genderfuckery, because it is all about subverting a lot of what we think is supposed to be man or woman. And that to me feels like a much better or more comfortable space to be in than either or. Yeah. It's like, no, why do we even have to have that? Like, how can we subvert that? How can we push against it? How can we turn it on its head? How can we sometimes make fun of it? Like, it is all constructed. It's all kind of silly in a way that we've all created these scripts and have to the point where we can say a word and we automatically know what that then means.
An image pops up.
Yeah.
But you know what? Right now I'm reading Queering Your Therapy Practice, and the author is going through social constructionism, essentially all of the isms and theories, and just reminding us how easy it is to fall into just another construct or even binary. And so, the author was reminding us that there is such a thing as heteronormativity. Right. But now we're also running to a place where there's homonormativity. And then can there be transnormativity? Like, are we going to get to this point where, as we are breaking out of these boxes, that people are then placed in yet another box and told, and I know we've touched on this before, like, you're not queering right, you're not trans right, you're supposed to look like this, or androgynous really looks like this, that then just makes us feel like, dang. Yeah. What do I do? I'm just trying to be me. Or I feel like I'm supposed to show up a certain way even while trying to deconstruct this whole gender thing and sexuality thing, for that matter. Yeah. No, sometimes I feel like, but I know, to me at least, my gender and sexuality are probably the least interesting things about me. But because of oppression and the social standards that we have to deal with, it is something that we have to identify, so that way we can affirm it and uplift it and make sure we have policies to protect it and make sure we're not being discriminated against. Right. But I really wish that it wasn't a big deal, right? I really wish someone, like, we don't have to come out about anything. We can just show up and it not be questioned, right? We don't have to explain anything. Like, can I just go to work? Can I just go to vacation? Can I just be without it being a spectacle?
so what that makes me think of is like maybe we can talk about how we then conceptualize our own genders, because I think what you're, for me in my head, I'm also thinking, what would the world look like if like we see gender as varying as there is the amount of people in the world, right? So like 7 billion different genders.
Yeah.
7 billion different sexualities, right? Like how can we get to this place where each and every person can just work to share with the world who they are within the context that they feel matters. So I would love for us to maybe explore or share a bit of how we've come to our own current understanding of our gender identities. So I think for me, and I kind of spoke about this when we talk about sexuality too, and you know, I think that oftentimes at some point, you know, at least in my opinion, when you start to question your sexuality or your gender, you're also going to question the other thing, right? So it's like, if I start to question my gender, maybe I'm going to start questioning my sexuality. If I start questioning my sexuality, maybe I'm going to question my gender, right? And so I think for me, when I was coming to terms with my sexuality, I was then trying to then figure out what it meant for me gender-wise too. And so that same time in undergrad, being around other people who were, you know, definitely like trans, non-binary, and getting to know those identities better and those people and how they move through the world, made me start to question and interrogate what that meant for myself, right? Especially when I think of like going back to the bro of it all. Like for me, bro is like mask for mask, like epitome of like gay male culture, and I do not like it. And I feel very uncomfortable oftentimes. Like I've had guys, you know, talk to me and be like, "Oh, are you masked though?" And I'm like, "What does that even mean? What like what?" And it just makes me feel really uncomfortable. And so, you know, I got to this place where I was just really, again, continuing to really question and look at what it meant for myself around my gender identity, and thinking about all the things that I was raised with, all the scripts that I came with, and how a lot of them, particularly around like what it meant to be a man, I didn't really agree with, right? And so like through that process, really getting to a place where I was really deciding for myself, I don't particularly feel like I am a man, but I also like don't feel like a woman, right? And kind of wrestling with that. And then
but what is that? But in that identification, right? In that language of saying, I don't quite feel like a woman.
Yeah.
What are you comparing it to be able to say that for yourself? I know for everyone this would be different, but for you, when you're like, okay, I feel a little bit of this.
Yeah.
Not enough of this.
Yeah.
What are the, how do you call it? Like the components, I guess. Yeah. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah. I think for me, and I think we're going to go back into like the how it's performed, and we'll talk about too like how we perform gender and gender expression. But so I think for me, when I think about when I was coming up, and at that time I felt like more and more like representation of like transgender women and what that looked like and what that meant. For me, I didn't have an attachment to it. I didn't have this idea of myself wanting to be those things, right?
Of what was pushed forward as what a trans woman is.
Yeah.
And so from there, you're like, okay, not that. I know I don't identify or connect with this piece. Okay. Yeah.
And so I think for me, a lot of it was looking externally of what people were saying or showing were these things that I didn't feel personally. And so, you know, I kind of got to this place where I just was like, very much so did not feel I was any of these stereotypical binary ideas of what it meant to be either or gender. And I knew that it was not those things, right? And I think from there, I just kind of sat with it for a while. And I think even now, you know, I will tell people I'm non-binary. That still doesn't feel quite right for me. Agender is probably a little bit closer. But even then, that still doesn't feel quite right for me. And I think that speaks to that piece of like my own personal conception of gender isn't necessarily going to fit nicely into the boxes that have been given to me. So far.
Creating your own.
Exactly. And then I remember like there's this one moment when I was in the Peace Corps and I was talking with a friend who I don't know. I think I was saying something about like, ugh, men are just the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just like, yeah, we really are, aren't we? And I just remember having a very visceral reaction. I was like, excuse me, who is we? I'm not including myself in this statement. And I think what I will say too is that time was also interesting for me because I was in a space where it was illegal to be gay. But because of how I saw masculinity, and I'm using air quotes right now, being performed in this other country, in a way, it kind of helped me further identify the fact that I was not this thing. Because the way masculinity was performed there was similar, but also different, right? Like, men would be holding hands and very affectionate towards each other. And I feel like that is not a masculine thing that we see in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And they are also able to move about the world in a different way. You know, I don't think anyone would clock me for being gay because of my feminine qualities. Again, air quotes.
Mm-hmm.
And then hair was also, again, a big thing for me there. Like, I still also remember, you know, so I started getting my hair braided regularly because of my friends at the health clinic I was working at. They were like, yes, we'll braid your hair, Musa. We'll do it for you. And I just really loved it and enjoyed it. And there was one instance that I remember too where this older man came into the clinic and they were braiding I think either my hair was braided or they were braiding it. And he was like, no, you shouldn't be doing that. Like, men shave their hair bald. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's what you should be doing. And my friend who was braiding had been braiding my hair and stuff, she was just like, no, we're not going to do that here. Musa can braid his hair here at this health clinic. And that was just like a really beautiful moment for me to be like safe and like comforted and know that like they have my back in that moment.
Yeah.
And so I think from there, I just continue to kind of clarify for myself that I didn't have this specific kind of idea of what my gender was. I just knew that what it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of where I am now. It's like I know what it's not, but I still don't have like clear, definitive piece of I am this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, like I am creating it as I'm going along in the world.
Yeah.
And the boxes that have been created currently just don't feel the best fit for me. But that's also why I like with pronouns, I can use he, they to kind of help somewhat people like get clued in on, oh, okay, if you're using he, they, maybe there's something more there.
Right. Maybe I don't lump you into this box.
Yeah.
Respectfully, hopefully.
Right.
Right. I use woman, she, her, she, yeah, pronouns. And I don't, besides lady, to me, woman means nothing to me. Like, not, like, I feel being called a lady just feels so much stronger just by the way that I, again, was raised and the expectations that came with that. Versus woman already feels so diverse to me. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't feel boxed in by that word because I already believe that a woman can be anyone, can show up any way. And the same thing for a man. So I know for me I know that's not everyone's truth in relationship to the word. But I don't, even though, I have different feelings internally that I may not even always express in my clothes. That's just not a fashion girl.
I try to be.
But yeah, I think I already grew up in a way where I was exposed to a lot of different ways that people can exist, and that was okay. Maybe they did experience some bullying sometime, just thinking about the time period and where I grew up.
Yep.
But it was still okay. And so I feel glad to have those experiences because I feel comfortable with that word and with my body. I think the thing that I have to work on the most, though, is just identifying when those expectations pop up in the language or the way that I speak to myself. So if I am getting dressed, like, how am I talking to myself, or who am I comparing myself against? Because I know for me, I sometimes just struggle with my body as a Black and Latina person who is just like, you're supposed to be very curvaceous and you're supposed to, all these supposed tos and how you should just put on makeup and da 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 da. That doesn't really bother me, like the makeup and how your hair should be. It was just more like hourglass.
Yeah.
You need to be stacked.
Yes.
Right? And, you know, as I was just getting older and seeing what was on TV and movies and stuff like that, I just had to make sure that I was okay with the way my body is, because I'm not doing anything different. There's nothing I can do, but well, I guess there are things I could do differently. Back in the day,
right?
Certain type of procedures, you know, that was for certain people with means, and now, though it seems a lot more accessible when you look at, you know, people getting BBLs and different types of gender affirming surgeries and procedures, like breast implants.
Yes.
But anyway.
We'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that later. Yeah. So when I think back to those times, it's just a matter of me challenging those ideas of what a woman's body is supposed to look like. Yeah. And it's just wild to me because bodies are bodies. Like, they look like so many different things regardless. I don't know. You know, I'm thinking, the reason I'm kind of pausing is because I'm just thinking of social media. Yeah. And just the commentary on people having similar thoughts. So if someone is, say Zendaya, for example, who's very petite.
Yes. And
people comment about her being masculine and being a man and all this other stuff. And a real woman is supposed to have curves. But it's just like, also, this is just this person's body. Like, it sucks that we're compared against something that we don't have any control over, you know. But then if someone does get the surgery, it's, oh, you don't like yourself, or you went overboard, or, you know, you could tell this person had this. Well, which one do you want me to be? This, I was a stick, and now it's fake. So really what you want is a perfect person who was born naturally to have this hourglass figure. Or if you know, if this is their idea of what a man is, then you like have the big shoulders and you have the pecs and you have the abs and you have the thick thighs and you know, all this other stuff. Right. Naturally. You know, and it just sucks that people can't exist. And I think that's what I'm just going back to. It's just, we already exist this way without any of the pressure to build our bodies, I guess, is what I'm thinking about. And how much more peace we could have if that was just okay to just exist in this way without people trying to shame you or embarrass you or belittle you. Yeah. I don't even know if any of that made sense.
No, it makes total sense. I appreciate the body piece, because what I didn't also talk about and mention was, like, part of the reason why I'm also, like, don't feel bothered about, like, being seen as a man is because my body, like, I know how people will perceive me. You know, like, I'm a 6'1" big black person who often people are like, do you play football? No.
But that's it, right? It's like Serena Williams.
Yeah.
Athletic, tall, and always question about not only her sex and her gender, right? So, but that's what I'm getting at. It's like, you can put two people together, one's female, one's male, who could have a very similar body type, and they're biologically different. There are people of the opposite sex than you who might look just like you, body-wise and body shape, size, on all this other stuff. Right? But because we have this idea that a man is supposed to be at least what is it now? I don't know. They want them to be like 6'3".
I swear.
You know, but if you are saying this is what a man is, and then a woman is that same thing, now she's a man. Or vice versa, you have a man being called effeminate or feminine because, you know, this person is 5'2", and they're also small or petite. Right. You know, and neither person can do anything about their genes.
Yeah.
So let them just be. But I think that's so interesting. Like what you're saying is, well, look at me. Of course, I can't get away from being called a man because of my shape and my size.
Yeah.
and someone who is female and identifies as woman is constantly challenged because they too are 6 something and have a larger body.
Yeah.
They're just not small enough to be considered a woman or feminine, or not considered, but to not be made fun of, at least, I guess.
Right. Or to be seen as such.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all arbitrary.
It's all fake.
Yeah.
It is. That's what burns me up the most. And to know how things have changed over time across cultures and societies, how the idea of what is quote unquote feminine and masculine, or what a man is supposed to do or a woman's supposed to do, is different everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think that's another reason why I'm just like, it's a word. Like, it gives very little insight into who I am as a person, because if you go to this country, it means this. If you go to this culture, it means that. If you look back into the 18th century, it means that. If you go back even further, it means something totally different. At one point, you know, if you wore pink, it was masculine.
Yeah.
Heels and wigs and makeup.
Listen.
Also looking at more European culture too.
Yes.
So when then you have a BIPOC person, like, how do we also trace back our experiences of gender and sex over time in those respective places? Because it wasn't the same as, you know, what was happening in Europe.
No. Definitely not.
Right. And there are other countries where you can hold hands, where people are wearing, you know, dresses, you know, whatever. And it's just like, this has nothing to do with me sexually or gender wise. Maybe it's access and resources or lack thereof. You know?
Absolutely.
Whew.
Yeah. I feel like we have delved into so much already.
Yeah.
And we
haven't even got to the questions yet.
So let's maybe like take a break here, and then we'll come back and do some like ground setting for people too, of like what it is, all these things that we're talking about as well.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Yes,
Okay.
let's do that. Hey listeners, did you know at Healing Exchange we have a bunch of therapists who specialize in gender identity and development? So if you've been looking for a soft space to explore what that means for you and how it could look, go to www.healingexchange.com/team to check out who's offering services and to schedule a free 15-minute consultation.
And we're back. So, you know, we were just talking about so much, and I know we were kind of delving into also.
We got a little ahead of ourselves.
We did. Just a little. You know, I think it speaks to how much we care about this topic and how much thought we've both been putting into it. And so, you know, I hope that the people listening are also feeling that vibe and also being like, yes, you know, because I do think that we don't talk enough about it, and then are only left with what is being told to us or what we're seeing, right?
Yeah, I think it takes us a lot longer. And I wasn't having these type of conversations as a younger person.
No.
So yeah, we don't talk enough about it. Or you know what? I don't know. Actually, I want to challenge that. I think we talk a lot about what it's supposed to be and look like.
Yes.
Like the limitations and expectations is what we talk about, but not in the freedom of expression and giving people more space to get creative, to finding a gender that works for them or language that feels good to them. Yeah, or not, you know, just not having that pressure at all to have to check a box.
Absolutely. So with that, we'd love for us to just talk quickly of even, you know, what is gender and how is that different from sex? So, you know, I think, you know, the big thing for me is you were saying like the biological sex, right? Talking about, I don't want to go too much into biology, but, you know, gametes and genitals and, you know, how, you know, male or female, which even then, honestly, there's more than just male or female if we're talking about intersex too. And, you know, but that's typically, you know, what we're born into this world with and kind of categorized into based on these like more physical characteristics that people have and develop as well. Whereas with gender, I feel it is that piece. Oh my God. I was just thinking like sex is like the science and gender is the art. right? Like gender is how we get to paint ourselves in the world and kind of create and construct this own idea of who we are and how we want to be perceived.
I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
And so yes, I think that gender then has endless possibility. Like we were just saying, right? Like 7 billion different genders for the 7 billion people that live on this planet. And so I think that gender is such a personal thing that for, unfortunately, what we're currently experiencing and seeing is still being reinforced as this binary of man or woman, when there are so many things to look at and to feel and identify as beyond those two amorphous ideas of what even I still don't really know what those things are either, but
yeah, I don't know. I just know what I do know is that I wish, well, now part of me is wondering if my desire for it not to be okay, I'm having internal experience right now of trying to be sure that I'm not minimizing, because I know a lot of folks have experienced a lot of violence and loss of connection and shame and loss of life around this. So when I say I wish it weren't a big deal, I don't want to minimize that truth for so many people. I think where I'm coming from is a place of hope, where when I say it doesn't matter, I don't mean it doesn't matter for you to figure it out. I mean, my hope is that it doesn't matter for folks as a source of putting pain into the life of someone else, or bullying them, or limiting them, or creating policies that erase people. So I just wanted to be clear, like when I say it doesn't matter, but for sure I want us all to know that we have a right to figure out all aspects of who we are on this earth, but that no one else should have a right to interfere with that, especially in a harmful way.
Yeah. No, I think that speaks to like the fact of, for me, when you said that, it's not mattering so that people can exist, right? So that there isn't an issue when someone goes to their family or their loved one and be like, this is who I am, and doesn't have to worry that it's going to matter to them. It just is.
Yeah. You just showed up to dinner.
Yeah. And then there are also some people that...
and then pull up a seat and get some food. Like, it's not a big deal.
Right. Yeah. And there's also some people who also want to reinforce those ideas of what it might be to be a woman or a man.
Yeah. And
that's also important too. And it's that self-determination piece that I think is so important, of you get to decide for yourself what you want to keep and what you want to throw away with any of this. And I think that for me is the difficult piece, is that oftentimes it feels like we don't necessarily get the choice. It has to be this or that. And that's the frustrating piece for me.
Yeah, definitely. It's the assumption and presumption that you have to fall in line in these two rigid ways or else. So.
Yeah. So I know we've kind of touched on this, particularly when we're talking about our own identities when it comes to gender and how they intersect. But I would love for us to talk more about, what is the significance of thinking about the intersectionality of gender and sexuality and race and class and, all these other social identities?
I think that the intersection of gender, sexuality, race, and class is as significant as is the policies fighting against all of them.
Yeah.
We make it significant because of the constructions that we forge within our societies and our communities and our families and our relationships and all this other stuff. So I think, going back to what I said earlier, I wish it were insignificant.
Oh, definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish that it wasn't a compounding existence for so many people. It's like, yeah, you have this thing, this identity marker, this way that you're being pushed to and beyond the margins. And, oh, yeah, here's another thing, add sexuality. Oh, and you're, BIPOC, put that on top. Oh, you're poor, put that on top. Oh, you're, so it's just like, I wish it weren't compounding like that, or intersectional, but it is.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate thing is when you look at the systems of oppression, it's really measuring us up against being a white male with status or income, resources and connections. And so, you know, we talked about the population of the world. Like, we're not all white men.
No.
Right. We can't be.
So,
but it sucks that that's what the comparison is.
Yeah.
It's impossible to meet. But we know that to some degree, a lot of us have been taught that when we're talking about work twice as hard to get half as far, you know, as who? As him.
Yeah.
And so that's how, you know, it kind of is broken down for me, is just realizing the additional struggles, pain, difficulties that someone is going to experience in their life based on their identities, and how their identities then impacts the way that they're able to show up and the resources they may or may not have access to. And generally, most importantly, I think how people will look at them. And then the stories or the narratives that come along with what other people think that identity means or stands for. So again, going back to that construct, what do people think of queer people in general, of men and women and Black people and poor people? There's a lot, you know. Yeah. I'm thinking about a common experience people talk about as, you know, being a Black person walking down the street and someone locks the door when you walk by, or crosses the street, or pulls their purse in just a little bit more tightly. I remember Resmaa Menakem, author of Grandmother's Hands, told a story about, I can't remember where he was living, but people just bump into him while they're walking, like just not see, you know, and he's like a tall Black man.
Yeah.
And just bump into him and then be startled, like, oh my God, well, you weren't looking, or you just, what was going on? But to be invisible in such a way. Right. Or maybe this idea of like, oh, you're going to move out of my way, but now we've collided because I assumed that, you know, you should have moved.
Let me tell you, just that, this is like a pet peeve of mine right now, when people, like, it is such a thing when, you know, I'm walking on the sidewalk and people are coming down, particularly if they're like with 2 or 3 people and they're taking up the space. And time again, they don't make the effort to move. And I've just started not make the effort either. I'm like, okay, I will walk into you. Let's do it, because you're going to see me. And I think that speaks to, for me, what you're talking about is like being seen as worthy. Be seen as worthy of consideration, of validation, of recognition. Of
being in this space.
Yes.
To take up space.
Yeah.
Right? And so when you are thinking about gender and gender expression, then what shifts when we're talking about that worthiness and taking up space and just having a right to be on the same sidewalk that I'm in? And now I'm having like flashbacks of just, you know, videos, stories, movie line, whatever the case is, of, you know, trans folks walking down the street and the harassment that they'll get, or the violence that they'll incur when, you know, they saw them from the back, but then, you know, something like that happened, and that person's anger or embarrassment or whatever they are feeling causes them to then yell obscenities and become violent. And in that scenario, there isn't even a concern of bumping into someone. That's just someone driving down the street who then decided to interact or engage with someone and then become violent, you know. And I think a lot of folks have this similar experience of, how do you handle catcallers and what is the risk of ignoring them? You know, there's way too many stories of it becoming fatal. If not even just a little aggressive, when folks feel rejected or embarrassed or turned down. So did you want to add anything about the intersection?
Well, so maybe we can talk a bit too, because I do want to talk about like gender and sex, right? And how that can play out. And I think that that's a big piece, is when we have trans identified folks and people who are attracted to them, and the potential danger that can come from that, right? Of,
of like disclosing or not
oh
disclosing.
yeah. Like I still remember I was working with some students years ago, and we were talking about different forms of oppression, and I'm not getting emotional just thinking about it. And we were talking about sexism, and one of the young men, these are like all black, black high schoolers. One of the young men, he was just like, oh, if I ever got with a woman and she turned to be a man, I'd kill her. I'd kill him. And in the moment, I was first off freaking out of like all the stuff that I was noticing coming up in me at that statement, and the just the uncomfortableness and the fear, and how to handle the situation, and also trying to remain within this role of facilitator and not wanting to fully shut him down, but try and shift some of that perspective and like the harm that kind of statement has. And I think what turned out to be great about the moment was, I did check him and I was like, that's a really strong statement. Like, where's that coming from? Like, it's not okay. But what was beautiful was the other students then calling him on it, and them saying that is not okay because of this and this. But when we know that there are people out there who think like that, who have those feelings, have those emotions, to people simply existing in the world, that is then where we do see that piece of, unfortunately, it isn't taken not seriously. It isn't taken as just being. That there's so much wrapped up into this between sexism, cissexism, heteros, all these things, right, that are wrapped up into it, that create an atmosphere of unsafety for a lot of folks who are not, in this gender binary and neat, imperfect ways like we're talking about. And so, I think that is really hard for me sometimes to navigate as well.
Yeah. Recently, I cannot remember who posted this, but it was a short reel or story. And the person was talking about placing the responsibility to disclose your quote unquote preference, as opposed to putting it on the trans person. And I think the example this person gave was, if you're allergic to cats, you can't just expect for everyone to just, hey, are you allergic to cats? Or before you come to my house, I have a cat. You would say, hey, I'm allergic to cats. Do you have cats? Right?
Yeah.
So definitely two different experiences, and we don't want to oversimplify it. But it also seems when that type of responsibility comes up, the transphobic person has a very visceral response to being told, this is what you should do. If you have a problem with this, you should state it, So I think it's a really tough conversation for folks to have, because it is so historically violent and unsafe. But we have to figure something out in the meantime, or while we're still trying to work on people not being as transphobic, right? But in the meantime, what do? We can't just wait for this time where everything is cool and no one's, has any, phobias and isms and things like that. We have to make sure that we're creating a space for people to live in now that's safe and welcoming. And I don't know.
Yeah, it's a hard one. And even for me, sometimes some guys, when they're the mask for mass vibe, they'll try and holler at me, and if the vibe is like really aggressively masculine, I'm just like, no. First off, I'm very intentional about what I share out in these spaces. So I'm trying to let people know, right? Like I definitely think about like how I present myself in certain ways to, give those signifiers of like, if you're looking for a mask, you might not want to look too closely here. Like it's there, but like it's also not. It's not what. And so I think that is also something, and I will say in some ways, like, this is like such a small thing, but I remember when I came back home from the Peace Corps and I was on hookup apps, I definitely noticed it moving a bit away from just only like gay men, and it was like more trans identified people and people who were looking for trans identified people. And so that to me was like a moment where I was like, huh, that's interesting. What would it look like to have it where we could all, again, right, just exist and be able to like share what it is that we're trying to look for and have, what type of experience we're trying to have in these like apps. And, you know, I think additionally, and so I'm also thinking of how that idea of like gender has been presented in culture and media and like institutions today too, and how maybe it's changed or evolved, or what are your thoughts around that?
One thing that really comes up to me when I'm thinking about diversity in media and culture is to look at the changes over time. You know, how can we be so strict and rigid about one thing when that one thing has changed constantly over time? It just kind of feels silly, like, oh, now we like it this way, when we know that it's been different.
Yeah.
What kind of
cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, do we have exactly, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Like, are we serious right now being so loyal to a fluctuation, you know? But also, I think, you know, since we are in the now, it would be a disservice to not look at how media and culture influences the ideas of what we believe gender is to be, or what makes us feel more aligned and affirmed in a particular gender identity or expression. And so earlier we were talking about BBLs and gender affirming treatment, care, procedures and surgeries.
Yeah.
And how so much of that is influenced, at least some, you know, in certain cultures, rap culture, music culture, and how that is just seen as the ideal body type that people then want to pursue because it comes with maybe money or acceptance, access, resources, a man that can take care of you or who will then value you in a certain way. Attention even, yeah.
Yeah.
A bag, a flight.
We love a bag.
And so, yeah, there are a lot of folks who, you know, over time are taught, oh, if I look like this, then these other things might be easier to access. So I'm going to pursue it. In addition to that, it could just be, I've been shown that this is what a blank body is supposed to look like. And so for me to feel more affirmed, I want to look like that. So it's very influential when you think about the power that music and music videos and celebrities have on how we view ourselves. It is unfortunately very much a mirror. And then the sad thing is that those people are also buying into the idea, thus kind of reinforcing it and creating the very thing that essentially it seems like nobody wants to live up to. I hear so many folks who are just frustrated by the comparison and then being made fun of because of the work that they've gotten. It's like, oh, we know you've gotten a job. Like, yeah, I'm famous. Like, you've seen me when I came on the scene. So, yeah, my face looks different and my body looks different, but now I'm being ridiculed for it. I'm being called out for it. But this is what you said you wanted. This is what is selling. This is, you know, is expected of me. Again, going back to the idea of who is this really for, you know?
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. And I think even for me, that gender affirming care, I think is such a important thing to think about because, you know, right now we can get into that a little bit after this, but, you know, on the institutional level, we are seeing so much legislation around the country targeting like trans affirming care, right? We're seeing like schools and doctor's offices, just all these like levels, sports, all these different levels of social control that are trying to be put into place. And yet when we think about like gender affirming care, hair plugs, breast implants, nose jobs, BBLs, tattoos, piercings, like, these are all things.
Ooh, piercings.
Piercings
At a young age, right? Because I need to make sure that you know my kid is a girl.
Yes.
So I'm gonna pierce her ears.
Yeah. These are all things that we do to like affirm and also like signify and signal gender, right? And so I think that piece is so lost on people because they're just worried about, oh my gosh, your son's gonna become your daughter and that's not okay, you know. I don't know where that voice came from, but it just baffles me that like we can't see that we've already been doing these things in so many different aspects of people's lives, that then the thing that bothers you is like this transgression of what you think someone is or should be.
Yeah.
Which is just really frustrating for me.
Yeah.
And I think on the flip side of that, I think, you know, we're talking about the difficulties of seeing these ideals in like culture and media and how they influence us. But I think that they also could be opportunities too, right? Like I know for me, one person that I've looked to is Alok Menon, who, you know, for me was a person that I definitely was able to look to of like, wow, I like the way they talk about gender, the way that they think about this, the way that they've contextualized even their own identity speaks to me, you know. Or even I remember I don't know why, but me, the Peace Corps, like it was just a time in my life I was but I remember during that time one of the first podcasts I really got into was a one called Food for Thought, THOT, and one of the hosts, her name is Din Michelle, and at the time she initially came out as non-binary, and she's this Black woman from New York, and it was like a big thing for me to see that representation as well. And I remember reaching out to her and being like, I don't know, like I just want to let you know how much that means to me for you to share that and to talk about this, because it means so much to me to see someone who looks like me wrestling with and talking about this topic. And so even as she has gone on to, you know, come out as a trans woman, or not come out, but to share with the world. I want to also like change that framework, like share with the world, like this is who she is. I continue to just really appreciate that as well. And so I think about how we can find those people who can help us also navigate our own journeys, as well as we try to figure out our own gender-ish as well.
Yeah. But we need the space to do that. We need, you know, accepting, loving, curious community to hold space for our exploration and, you know, curiosity, and not feeling like we have to hide parts of ourselves while we're in certain spaces, right?
I feel that. So how about this? Let's take another break.
Okay.
And then we'll come back to jump into some of those pieces. Okay.
Let's do it.
All right. And welcome back. So you were just talking about like how to have, you know, these affirming spaces, and I would love for us to start talking about what does it look like to, you know, be able to center our curiosity, our exploration, and most importantly our joy, because I think that that's the piece that can feel, and especially currently, really difficult to center when there is so much going on in our country that's targeting you know, folks who are not within the binary. So how do we start to center some of that?
Yeah. I think a large part of this is centering community. You know, so much of the pain that we're talking about occurs from other people, right? Their thoughts, their beliefs, their policies, all this other stuff. And so I think in order to start challenging that, we have to create a space that is the opposite of that. We have to be amongst people who can create space for our curiosity to explore, to challenge and push back and create something new altogether. And that just resonates in our body and our brain. That's like, oh, this thing is possible because here are my people. It's not just, you know, all the naysayers and the violent people out there who are making me feel unsafe, because I know I have friends and family and partners and, you know, professors and Instagram folks that I follow, like whatever, that are doing things differently, that I can welcome into my life as well. So I think that's a big piece. And I really like your question of joy, right? So much of, unfortunately, our lived experience, we can get really stuck on identifying what we don't want, what we don't like, what we're trying to get rid of, and not always as much time on what we do want, what we do like, what we want more of, what makes us feel good, what makes us experience joy and pleasure. And so I want to challenge us to keep that in mind. Yeah. Yes, we need to fight, but we also need to rest and we need to experience joy. And all of our time cannot just be on that one part of our activism. Right.
Joy is resistance.
Joy is resistance, and you deserve it. And we do not have to reach this utopia that I don't even know. And we do not have to wait until, you know, everything is quote unquote perfect before we can rest and experience joy. So I really think we have to be intentional about that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I know for me, so much of what has allowed me to get to this place of like my own current understanding of gender is because of the people around me, you know, creating this space to be able to process, to navigate, to explore, to play with, you know. I actually also just like the joy piece, right? Like I recently bought a dress from ASOS. I'm an ASOS hoe. Like I love me some ASOS. And I bought this dress, and you know, I've already been buying more like, again, you know, air quotes feminine clothing you would find like the women's sections of stores and stuff, but they've also still have been like within the confines of a masculine nature, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
you
like
know?
a blouse and slacks.
Yes,
but not
exactly.
Yeah.
And so like this dress, I remember when I got it, and I got a couple others too, but this was the only one that spoke to me and made me feel good when I was looking at myself and feeling what it felt for me, what was bringing up in me, and affirming, you know, what I wanted to feel in that moment. And I'm just waiting for the moment to wear it out. Yes. And I know that for me, it's also like being surrounded by people who will make me feel comfortable to be able to do it. But let me tell you, it's a really cute dress. I look great in it. It just brought me a lot of joy.
I love that.
You know?
You know, and I think so much of this, and I know we talked about this before when we're highlighting sexuality and exploration, but I think we have this compulsory idea of coming out. Yes. And like what it means to live your truth and things like that, which sure, we can have that too, but it's not the only way to exist as someone pushing against the ideas of sexuality and gender. And so if you are in a place right now where you are buying things online and trying them on and just prancing around in your house, and
we love that.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Don't pressure yourself to feel like you have to go out and about in it. I know some folks who are exploring with like binding, and they do it at home, you know, for now, and maybe who knows how long, but that's okay. And that does not minimize, or it doesn't minimize your gender expression or make you inauthentic at all. So I think that's something that we really have to be mindful of, that again, we're not falling into this blank normative behavior, right, where to be genderqueer, whatever, means you have to exist in a certain way on a certain timeline. So I think that's another major piece, is giving people space to play and figure it out without following these rigid guidelines or expectations of what it means to be queer.
Right.
I think is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, and that to me also speaks to like, we haven't talked about like transitioning, right? Like transitioning for some people is affirming. It brings them joy. It makes them feel that they're in the body that they want to be in and need to be in, right? To live the life that they want to live, particularly when we think about like body dysmorphia, right? But then there are other people who can exist in the body that they're in and still identify as trans, and that's perfectly okay. Like it's not this like predisposed like idea that you have to medically transition to be this thing.
Yeah. It's saying this is me outside of this cis-normative expectation placed on my body, period.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that. I don't identify as that. I'm trans.
Period.
But I think that's something that, like, at least I've witnessed in, you know, some discourse when it comes to queer identity and gender more specifically that folks are grappling with within the community.
Yeah.
You know? It's like, oh, when in sometimes it does seem like, you know, it's coming from a place of curiosity and excitement, like, oh, when are you going to transition, or what support do you need, or and they're just like, I'm good. No, this is inside work. This is an inside job. Like, I'm feeling good. Wherever I go, I know I'm trans and I show up this way, and I'm not trying to change anything particularly right now or ever. And that's okay. But I think we really have to be responsible and intentional that we are not yet again having these rigid ideas of what it now means to be whatever. You know, it's like we've already stepped out the box. Let's not go into another. So yeah, I love that reminder. Yeah. And I think we just have to be mindful of it. It's easy. It's comfortable. It's predictable. Yeah. And we know our body and brains want that predictability. It wants that thing, that ability to guess and to assume correctly. But then maybe we need to do some nervous system work. Right. We need some regulation skills, self and partnered and community and all this other stuff to kind of settle ourselves. Because there is no one way. As we said, there's billions of people on this earth, and so there's billions of ways to exist. Yeah. And that should be okay. It should be fine and not tolerated. It should be more than tolerated.
That also reminds me of years ago, back in undergrad, I believe, I was at a talk with this. She's a professor at the undergrad institution I was at, a trans woman. And the one thing I remember from this talk was her saying, like, this idea of, like, 1,000 genders blossoming or something like that, right? Of, like, what would the world look like, right? If we could just allow for all these different ways of being to blossom and to exist in their own beauty. And that has definitely stuck with me. And I think that speaks to what you were just saying too.
Yeah. I just had it when you were talking about blossoming, I just had this image of just living in a colorless world. Like Pleasantville type of thing. But now I'm thinking of, like, as people blossom, it just, like, adds color to the scene as they, like, shed those norms. It's like they move out. But I don't know. Now that sounds like a whole nother binary. Black and white and color.
But we brought it up during the sexuality episode, so I think that's funny that it came up again. And I think it also speaks to what I was saying, how, like, in the moment I was like, gender is the art, right? It is the way that we get to the paint. Yeah. And so I think that is a really cool point to also touch back on too. And then also, I love Pleasantville. So, so I think one thing we had talked about gender affirming care in the sense of, like, piercings and but I also want us to talk about, like, what does it look like? Because I think there's, again, a lot of misconceptions, particularly around, like, younger people, where we see all this legislation happening about this idea of, like, oh, if your child wants to, like, transition, they're going to medically transition at, like, 12 or what have you, and that's just not the case. And so I want us to talk about, like, what does it mean when we talk about gender affirming care?
Yeah, so okay, I have a couple of thoughts about this, so I want to say my one idea first and then see exactly where you're going with it. Okay, sure. So, you know, we are therapists here, and I do a lot of training sometimes around LGBTQIA concerns and care for clients. And something that tends to come up is affirming and inclusive care.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wanted to break that down for a moment because they are two different things. So when we're talking about affirming, in this case, gender affirming care, what we're talking about is highlighting that the practice or the clinic or the provider provide care that affirms that person's gender. So that might look like, are you writing letters so that they can pursue gender affirming procedures, right? Are you skilled in helping people discuss their gender identity and how they may want to expand or explore or challenge it, right? So the care that you're providing is specific to that person's gender experience and affirms that as a valid experience, and you are holding a space for that. Inclusive care is, in gender inclusive, essentially means you're welcome here. All people are welcome. Regardless of your gender identity, expression, how you exist, we are doing our best to be trauma-informed, gender-informed, to not be, transphobic and all this other stuff. We are here to treat you, not necessarily your identity. So I just wanted to break that apart. When we're talking about someone who's gender-affirming in their care, that means that part of you is welcomed as it relates to the care that you are receiving, and inclusive is everyone's welcome. Neither is, I'm not saying one is bad. I'm just saying that we need to be clear in our language as providers, and also that is something you want to look out for as a client pursuing care, because sometimes it does seem to be used interchangeably, and that could just be, lack of training, education, But essentially, I like to say the right thing so that people know exactly what to expect. Because I've had those situations where, I've worked with the client and they've gone through the whole consultation process at another place only to learn that, this person is not really well trained or informed about gender concerns or sexuality concerns, but they are affirming, they are, not transphobic or this other stuff. But that only gets me so far. What I really need is to have the surgery, and I need someone to help me write this letter, right? And not everyone does that or has the skills or the interest to. So just be mindful of that.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think for me, the piece that I really wanted to focus on was the care of it. And even going back to that day that, like, for all people, transitioning isn't medically transitioning. So affirmative care can look like, let's talk about, what does that mean for you, right? What does gender mean for you? What does that look like for you? Does your name feel right? If not, how can we socially transition, right? Like, what does it look like to pick a name that feels more in line with who you are, to be able to live out your days with that instead of your dead name, right? What does it look like to start to decide of how you want that gender expression to look like? How can we work with you to really navigate those pieces of care that are oftentimes such a big piece of all that, and beyond just like the physical transition of it, but like the how do you want to live in the world, right? And I think that a lot of people don't think that that's a part of it. I think they only stick with the medical transition piece of it and don't think about all the things that come either before or without that.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I want to make sure that we also bring into this, is that gender affirming care doesn't mean you're medically transitioned necessarily. It can mean that you're working with a provider, a clinician, to feel affirming your gender, whatever that means for you. And so I think that that's a really important piece that is often missed or overlooked or misconstrued or trying to be twisted, particularly, again, I think when we're talking about, like, with younger humans.
Yeah, and it's important to differentiate that, because then it kind of puts us again in another rigid idea of gender. If we're just saying, like, hey, I have some questions, or I don't really feel I relate to these other ideas, and then the first intervention, the course of action is, okay, well, hormones and all this other stuff. Maybe that can come down the line, but right now I'm talking about just feeling more comfortable and not feeling forced to perform or show up in another way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like if we expand outside of gender affirming care only meaning gender affirming surgeries and procedures, then that also just increases the options that people believe that they have to get creative and to explore what that means for them and get to that eventually if they want to. But again, transitioning or not doesn't take away or add to your trans identity or non-binary identity in a way that should be limiting you. And so that's why I think it is important for people to know that they have multiple options, that transitioning medically isn't the only way or the idealized expectation as a trans person or even non-binary or age, whatever it is, that having gender affirming care is about you as a person where you are today and having that safe space with someone who can help you navigate these conversations to increase more insight and self-awareness. That's the thing right there. All the other stuff can come at a later time, if at all. May not be an interest, and that's okay. And that doesn't invalidate your gender experience at all. And I think that can be really hard for folks, especially for young folks, if they're only shown this is what it means to be, to challenge gender norms and societal expectations. And now parents who are just may freak out about what next steps may be, or may not want their kid to get gender affirming care for fear that that's what it might lead to. But yeah, so same thing with sex. It's like when we're doing sex ed, we're not teaching, grade schoolers 50 Shades of Grey.
No.
Right? We're talking about boundaries and consent and autonomy and anatomy and things like that. But people like to jump ahead sometimes because it's a lot of, we talked about fear-based things. So we got to be really mindful about this work and intentional to make sure that we are doing good work and we are creating an expansive picture that is continually added to with each individual. Yeah.
And I also just realized that we definitely, when you were mentioning like non-binary agender, I don't think I even gave definitions of what those things are. So I want to make sure we just go back really quickly. Like non-binary identity, typically it's kind of an umbrella term that really denotes kind of not existing within the binary of man or woman. And then agender is typically understood as like not having a gender at all. And so I just wanted to make sure we throw that in for people if they're for like, you said these things and you never explained them.
Just kept talking.
Just kept talking.
Thank you.
So, yes. So we're coming to the end, and this is the end of the episode, the end of the first season.
Yes.
And so are there any like final thoughts that you have about this episode or like just the season in general that you would like to share with folks as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think for this episode, my wrap up would be kind of the same, the sexuality one, which is be you and find the places and the people where being you is welcome in a way that doesn't put you in a box. So if you do want to step out one day dressed in certain colors and styles and then the next week is totally different, that people just say you look good and not bat an eye or question you in a way that doesn't feel loving, as opposed to like question like, oh, where'd you get that? ASOS?
You already know.
That was cute. And for us to also show up in that way, right? So I think a lot of times we put a lot of the focus on the gender queer person, the non-binary person, the trans person, on how showing up can be easier for them, quote unquote. But we also want to speak to all of us who may be upholding some of these gender stereotypes and how we can be more mindful of that and hold ourselves accountable to breaking some of these ideas that are violent and hurting our community. So we all have to do this work.
I love that. Yeah, I think for me, just a reminder that this isn't set in stone, that it's not static, that it is dynamic. gender is dynamic. Gender is dynamic. It is ever shifting and evolving, and we get to decide for ourselves what that then means. And I think the more we can get to a place of comfort in ourselves within that, the more we then can allow ourselves to really explore the limits of it, which are boundless. So
Thank you.
And I think for the season, I just want to say how difficult, like, this has been a lot of work. It has really stretched me in some really significant ways that I am thankful for. So thank you for like taking this idea that I had many months ago and running with it with me. And I think just, creating this content and having these conversations have just continue to improve my own knowledge and space to like further learn and understand these topics. But then two, that personal piece too, it is continue to also allow me to turn into myself and to, examine like where it is that my current ideas around all of these topics come from and where I also hope to go with it. And so it's just been a cool space for me as well. And so I then hope that it has been that for the listeners as well. And to the listeners, I really appreciated, being able to create something for people to turn to and really interrogate. Like, that's my thing. I think we were talking about this recently. Like, I am very much so like, I interrogate myself a lot, and not in like a negative way, but in like I'm looking at things and I'm holding them up to the light to really get a sense of what it is that's going on here. And so I really hope that our listeners are having those opportunities to do that for themselves as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that beautiful wrap up and reflection.
Yeah.
Well, that is the first season.
Yes.
We will be back with season 2, in which we will be covering a variety of topics centering relationships.
So excited.
So we'll see you soon, and make sure you are following us at Soft Landing Podcast on Instagram, that you head to our website to get all of the previous content and worksheets from this season's episodes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. And you can also rate us, subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, and submit your questions.
Yes, submit your questions.
Yes.
And share.
Yes, please share with folks. Okay, we're out of here, and we'll see y'all soon. Bye.